past mine. But there's all kinds of career options out there that if you're a scientist, if you're an engineer, if you're a political scientist, whatever your discipline might happen to be, there's work in these fields that could be incredibly helpful to you. Make sense? All right, so let's get into the next slide. Here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to go through some introductions for Tim and I, and we're going to take you through some of our history because it matters. One of the things, because I'm a local person, I was born and raised in Modesto. I went to MJC. You don't always know what the world of career possibilities looks like when you're out there. So and I'll get into that in a minute, and Tim will explain him, and he's not local. Tim is from Ireland, so he'll give you that kind of history. We'll go through those introductions and kind of take you through our history and how we got to where we are. And then hopefully that will open your eyes to some future possibilities for those of you that are students, and those of you that are not students, at least you know the world that you live in around you. So that'll be the first thing we do. Then we're going to get into the actual world of regulations and compliance. And that'll be kind of the meat of the presentation today. We're going to take you through all the laws and regulations, how they get developed and how they translate directly to the manufacturing sector, how they translate into government work. So if you're a regulator or an enforcer for the government, how those laws affect what you do for a living. And we'll take you through some examples in the wine sector and how some of those very specific things relate to what we do. Then we'll get into what are the translatable skills into manufacturing and government work that you would need to be successful in these type of careers. So we'll walk you through that. And then lastly, we'll leave you with some takeaways. So hopefully when you leave today, you not only understand the discipline and what Tim and I do for a living, but you'll walk away with some actual action items and things you should think about and consider and pursue as you're thinking about your careers moving forward. Make sense? All right. Sound good? You want to clap now? No? Okay, that's fine. You don't have to clap now. Yeah, I would, yeah. So Tim and I will be a little bit of a comedy routine here to keep you entertained for the next hour. All right, so there we are. Fortunately, I shaved my beard, so I don't look quite as old as I did when I took that picture, so that's a good thing. As I mentioned, I'm born and raised in Modesto. I actually went to MJC. I got my degree in biology. I got an AS degree in biology here. Then I went away to a four-year school, and I finished my four-year degree at Cal Poly Humboldt. So I've been in California my whole life. I had great expectations when I graduated school because I actually have a degree in wildlife biology, if you can believe it. I had hopes of chasing bugs and bunnies and fish around the forest and the rivers, and that's how I intended to spend my career. And I did that for a while. And I enjoyed it. But there was other aspects of the science world that I actually really liked a lot more. So when I came back from working one of my jobs for the government, I came back, I actually was golfing in Modesto at Dryden, and I got paired up with a guy to golf with who worked for a company called Tri-Valley Growers. Some of you have been around for a while. Who knows Tri-Valley Growers? Yeah, a few of you, right? They were a big fruit and vegetable packer in town, been around since the 1940s. They're since have gone out of business, and actually Gallo bought one of their properties in town. And I worked for them in the Environmental Affairs Department. And this was back in the early 90s. So when I got paired up with this gentleman, he goes, hey, we're starting this new department called Environmental Services because there's all these regulations that exist out there in California, and we really need someone to help us look after those regulations to make sure we comply with them, to make sure we're doing all the reporting correctly, and to really help us be better as a business. And I said, well, gee, does it pay more than like $1,200 a month in room and board, which is all I was making at the time? And he says, yeah, I think we can probably beat that. So began my career in the environmental affairs field. From there, I went on to work for Frito-Lay in town. I was part of I was their operations and maintenance manager for their plant. And I also did all their environmental work and some of their health and safety work as well. Again, following the same disciplines, but I expanded my horizons a little bit. And then I went back and forth between them and Tri-Valley a couple times, but I ultimately ended up at Gallo. And Gallo really wanted me because I was a local person who understood the environmental health and safety regulations very well. I knew all the local regulators, I knew all the laws, and they wanted to grow and expand their department in Gallo because it was a rapidly growing business. right? So they hired me, and now almost 25 years later, I'm towards the end of my career, and I've enjoyed every aspect of my time at Gallo. It's been a ton of fun. We've been able to do all kinds of things. Despite the fact laws and regulations don't seem that exciting, they actually can be. You know, depending on how you choose to work in them, they're a lot like clay. Right? You have to understand them well, you have to understand their intent, but there's a lot of interpretation in regulations too. And you have to be smart enough about the details of the regulations to understand how they work, what their intentions are, and to make sure you're complying appropriately with whatever your obligations are. Okay? So that's my history. Now I'm going to turn over to Tim and let him introduce himself, and which is going to be much more colorful than mine, I promise. As long as there's what, Guinness in the story.
Okay, we'll go with that. So good afternoon, everybody. Tim Ryan, and Chris has given you his history, which is very California Modesto-centric. I am not that. I grew up in Ireland. I went to school in Ireland, and I did my undergraduate, and it excites me every time I look back on the wisdom of that now, but I think it opened doors for me. And then I went to Toronto for 2 years to do a postdoc. And then I thought, you know what? I've had enough of university for a while. What am I going to do? So I came out on spec to California, got an interview at Gallo, and now 31 years later, I'm still there. Okay. So the pathway for me, as you start to look at careers and you get into regulations and compliance, chemistry. What do you use chemistry degrees for at Gallo? Well, there's a lot of research, R&D type efforts, and that's where I started. Grape and wine chemistry was my background for the first 10 years of my career. I moved in then to more of a QA environment, and for the past 20 plus years, I've been over the compliance and regulatory affairs department at Gallo. So it's quite the transition in terms of moving from a science or chemistry degree into the compliance area. I call myself a recovering ex-chemist in terms of what I do every day, okay? But having the knowledge of the chemistry, being able to apply it then into the product that we make, be it wine or other things, and then understanding the regulatory environment and regulations around that. And as we'll talk about what we do and the skill sets to use in that space, I think it's important to have that balance. We really value technical experience, but we love it to be applied into our environment. So I think that's my background in a nutshell. I don't know, was it more colorful, Chris? As far as the Guinness, thank you. I have visited Guinness and worked with Guinness. So I've done that over time. I have worked with the whiskey industry in Ireland as well. So there's some perks out of it, right? So, you know, and of course, you know, it's also said it takes a lot of good beer to make wine. So, but anyway, that's another story. Do you want to?
Yes, they can ask questions along the way.
Yeah. Any other questions other than Guinness? So,
this will be much more interactive if you guys ask questions along the way. We're happy to stop. The presentation is not such we have to continue, right?
So Chris talked about careers, and I think it's important. It probably would have been good to show a breakdown of what the background of careers were, and we'll talk about that, but we will talk about it later in terms of technical degrees, but also political, business administration degrees, so we'll talk about that. This is just an indication of that at all levels of education, where people get into this regulations environment. And I think that's important that, most people will get in with a bachelor's degree, but you can progress all the way up along. There's challenges and opportunities for everybody. The other part in this slide that's very interesting is when you talk about regulations, where do people work? And I won't say half and half because you'll see the breakdown, but federal government has only 10% of the actual people working in compliance and regulations. So what are the others doing? They're working with the regulators. Now, I think we have the state and local government. State and local government is much higher, so that puts it up to 35%, okay? But the rest is industry, and we are working with regulators on this. Now, the regulators in many cases have exactly the same experience, the exact qualifications as we do. In many cases, they've gone back and forth between the private sector and government. So as we think about careers in that space, very similar set of skills, very similar set of soft skills that we'll talk about that you can use in this space. So Chris, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk about the world that you live in right now.
No. Yeah, take that. All right, thank you. All right, so as I said, please stop and ask questions, raise your hand, and I'll repeat the questions for those online, okay, if we need to. Now we're going to get into a deeper dive. So Tim and I just gave our backgrounds, which are quite varied and diverse. If you had to assume that Tim and I would do similar type of work, just hearing what our degrees were in and what our early careers were, you wouldn't necessarily say, you know, Tim and Chris do the same kind of work. But the reality is we've got a whole wide range of disciplines that work in the fields that we work in. Mike Coomer, who happens to be the gentleman sitting back there in the blue chambray shirt, used to work with us, and Mike is a chemist as well, right? So he used to work for Shell in his early days in Modesto, correct? So, and Mike did this work for ourselves and for Hilmar Cheese for many, many years until he retired a couple of years ago. So again, just a wide range of possible disciplines. What is key though is understanding to be successful in this career, what's key is understanding where these regulations come from, right? Because you can have your science degree and all of these regulations are based in science to one degree or another. There's some politics in there, but the reality is they're largely based in science. So Tim, if you could go on to the next one. Let's talk about where they come from. So regulations are a bit like a nesting doll. Okay, so it goes from the federal government, which is the bigger part of the doll, down to the state government, down to local government, and then into international. And all along that train, there are people who work in these fields. So obviously everybody has heard of EPA and they've heard of Cal OSHA and they've probably heard of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms departments. All of those are part of the federal government, right? And within those fields, there are literally thousands and thousands of people that work in those fields across those various entities. The federal government is really where our regulations come from, at least at the outset. Okay, they're the ones who define the parameters and how manufacturing takes place, how regulations occur, how we do things to protect the environment, how we do things to protect the air, the water, the soil, all of that, right? From there, it cascades down to the state level. And the state level has similar groups of people in very similar departments who take those federal regulations and then they apply them at the state level. They do, however, have a lot of autonomy in order to impose their own requirements. And everybody here native Californian? Anybody not a native Californian? Well, all right. Yeah, okay. The Irishman doesn't count. All right. Yeah. So in California, we are one of the two most complicated states when it comes to all things regulatory, right? Because we have a full-time legislature. The legislature likes to do a whole lot of things. They like to have a heavy focus on protecting the environment, protecting the people, all those things, which are wholly appropriate. But as a result of that, what they do is they take the federal requirements and they do an overlay on top of that that's much more detailed and complicated, right? States can never be less stringent than the federal government, but they can always be more stringent. And then you have local. And we'll get into what some of these agencies are in a minute, but at the local level, we have people in Stanislaus County who help implement some of these regulations. We'll talk about an organization called the Certified Unified Program Agency, and we call that CUPA for short. They're basically the counties throughout the state, and their job is to do active enforcement of all the manufacturers that are in this area across a wide range of programs. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Yeah, go ahead.
You said California's one of two. What's the other one?
New York. Yeah. So the two most populous states in the nation, pretty much. And they happen to be on both coasts. Good question. And the question was, what was the other state that was as complicated as California? Although California is still the most complicated of all 50 states by far. So yeah, you should not be. Anyway, and then you have that weird little overlay on the outside, which is international, right? So international does not directly influence the regulations of what the federal government does. But what it does do, and Tim will talk about this a lot more in his presentation, it has a heavy effect on international trade. because it controls things like Customs and Border Protection. It controls things like standards of identity for products. So international regulations actually matter quite a lot. And it's one of the areas that Tim and I really enjoy playing in because, you know, in my title, it says global. That's because the work I do is global. Tim doesn't have that in his title, but he does that each and every day. So we work with federal, state, local, and we work internationally literally on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, which is kind of a cool part of our jobs, honestly. We get to travel, we get to see the world, we get to interact with people from all over the world that have very different perspectives on life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And that's one of the best things about our job. And if you'd asked me, you know, when I started doing this 35, 38 years ago, did I know that was going to be part of my career choice and would that be the part I liked the most? The answer would have been no, because I honestly would never have known about it. Because when you sit in the classroom here or you grew up in this area, you're fairly limited in terms of what you're exposed to. And what is so nice about being part of a bigger organization, and I used to work for Frito-Lay and PepsiCo, so a big multinational, is you get exposed to so many things and you understand how what you do and what you're interested in can really be applied in so many different areas. And this is just one of them, but it's the one that Tim and I really enjoy. Next slide. All right, so everybody got their cup of coffee. We're going to talk about regulations for a minute. And I'm not going to get into detail on every one of these. But when it comes to environmental health and safety regulations at the federal level, all of these regulations and acts came about because something bad happened, right? They didn't just decide to do it because they wanted to do it. Usually there's an instigating event. So when you look at the very top in 1970, you had the formation of the Occupational Safety and Health Act. We call it OSHA, right? Everybody heard OSHA before? Its whole mission in life is to make sure that workers, not only manufacturing, but in all businesses, are protected. And the reason that they had to put that in place is because there was a time in our history that was not always top of mind with folks that employed people. Right? And some people got hurt and they got hurt fairly badly. When OSHA was put into place, as a result of some of those implementing regulations that came from it, the amount of deaths that occurred within manufacturing and the workplace dropped dramatically. The amount of people that got injured dropped dramatically because it built programs and processes to make sure those folks were looked after. Right? So, you know, we rail against regulations sometimes and think they're not a good thing and they impede growth and blah, blah, blah. And in some cases that's true, but the reality is in most cases they actually serve good purpose, right? So none of us would want to go to our jobs on a daily basis without that 1970 Act having been put in place. Okay? All right. The next big one was in 1972, which is the Clean Water Act. Anybody guess what the Clean Water Act might have been about? Come on, I got to get you guys engaged here. We're talking about regulations and
Clean water.
hey, there you go. Yeah, so it's all about providing clean water and ensuring that you have clean water. And that comes in two areas. One is to make sure that the rivers and streams and the groundwater are all as pristine as they can be, and to make sure that nothing is done to those that negatively impacts that. Because again, there was, you know, many times when we had rivers that caught on fire in the East Coast because things were getting dumped in those rivers that they shouldn't have been, caused a lot of damage to fish, and it was such a volatile chemical they were putting in, the river actually caught fire. Okay, not a good thing, right? But you don't hear about that today, do you? Because these acts exist, which is pretty cool. And then also drinking water, right? So you have drinking water regulations came out of the Clean Water Act as well. So, and we'll talk about that later. There was a more detailed act that went into place, but that's all about making sure that when you turn your tap on, you can turn your tap on and feel safe about drinking your water. You know, those of us that have traveled the world, and Tim can speak to this even more than I can, that's not always the case everywhere you go, right? In some places, particularly south of the border, if you go to Mexico, if you go to some of the South American countries, you need to be careful, right? Because our digestive systems are not set up for some of the things you might encounter. Those Clean Water Act and these other acts help protect us from that to make sure you can always turn your tap on and feel good about it. Safe Drinking Water Act, that was a much more detailed act that put in place about drinking water like I discussed. FIFRA, which I was going to write out, but it was taking up too much room on the slide. I just put rodents. So it's the Fungicide and Rodentia Act. So basically, it's how you apply pesticides and herbicides to make sure that when those get applied, they are done in a proper way that is as protective as possible of the environment and of the wildlife in those areas. So that really matters quite a lot. And remember, people do what Tim and I do. Well, this is more my world than Tim's. He'll talk about alcoholic beverage in a minute. But you have to know all these acts. You have to know all the regulations that go with them to be effective. So, and all of your science work applies in every one of these acts. Not one of these doesn't have a science component to it that you have to use your science degrees to understand. Toxic Substances Control Act, think about that as hazardous waste. That's the easiest way to think about it, to make sure people are not dumping things that can turn rivers into flaming, flaming rivers over time. That's what that's about. There's much more detail, but that's the high level of it. Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. So, anybody know what Bhopal, India is? Okay, just
Killed a lot of people.
it did. So Union Carbide, which was an American company that was doing business out of India, actually had a release of a very toxic material, and it ended up killing a lot of people in the town. And it happened for all kinds of reasons, but what the people in the town did not know is how toxic those materials were that they were living next to. And as a result of that, many, many people died. So that law is what requires all manufacturers in the US who use highly hazardous chemicals. Are we still on? Okay, good. It got kind of dark. Am I having a stroke? No? Okay, good. All right. It requires people to notify those in the community what they're around. And it also requires that you put one of the most complex and secure programs in place for those chemicals to ensure that they never, ever get released. And our reporting for those chemicals is at such a low level that they want to know every small amount of those materials that gets released so that you have a very robust response program that helps you deal with it to make sure it never gets big and we never have a Bhopal, India again. And thankfully, that has really never been the case in the US, but it was a very hard lesson to learn. The next one's about oil pollution, and we had Clean Air Act amendments. So this is about don't dump oil, right? Oil in California actually is a hazardous waste. Did you know that? So when you go get your oil changed in your car, right, that goes to a specific recycler. California is one of the few states that actually considers it hazardous, by the way. Many other states do not, but that ensures that those are done properly. It also ensures that those who manufacture oil products have a proper mechanism for running their business and making sure they don't do major releases that can cause environmental harm. I'm going to avoid TSCA reform because that's the same thing as I mentioned down there, the Toxic Substances Control Act. What they did is they just enhanced how challenging it is to use hazardous chemicals and to make sure that you properly have programs in place to ensure you do not have negative releases. And I'm oversimplifying because I'm looking at Mike back here who lives and breathes this stuff, so he knows how much I'm really hitting the top line. But in all of these worlds, right? So you can have all kinds of degrees, you can be focused on all kinds of things, but you have to learn these laws and regulations in order to be successful. Tim? Yeah. Sorry?
EPA. What's that fit in?
So EPA is basically over everything there except OSHA.
Overriding everything.
Yeah, actually, that's a perfect lead into my next slide. So, all right, I'll give you a candy later.
That's like when we have.
That's exactly, that was perfect. So, by the way, you look very familiar, so we're going to talk afterwards. All right, so when you talk about those critical acts I mentioned, these are the implementing agencies that actually take those laws and turn them into regulations that we have to deal with. You do have EPA, right? So that's the big one. Its main mission in life is develop environmental programs and regulations that everybody has to comply with. And they have an enforcement arm. So within EPA, there's literally thousands of people that work in EPA across the country. So if you like that type of work and you want to be the person that's actively enforcing those laws and regulations, EPA is a good place for you to go, right? But they're the overarching authority. When it comes to worker safety, it's actually federal OSHA. It's the the next symbol on the right there from your perspective. And then there's Cal OSHA. Okay, so federal OSHA does their big safety programs that apply to everybody, and then Cal OSHA does their own overlays to that. And California is one of the few states that actually has their own OSHA program that's independent of the federal OSHA program. Okay, like everything else in California, we do things big, right? And better. There you go, big and better. From there, it cascades down to the local programs. So we have California Environmental Protection Agency. So it's our version of EPA at the state level, right? So they take those federal EPA requirements, they do more overlays to that. And then from there, it goes to the counties. And that's those CUPAs that I talked to you about. So if you go to Stanislaus County and you go on their website, there is usually a bunch of jobs working for the CUPA. And they look at programs like water and wastewater and things called risk management plans, which is basically those highly hazardous chemicals I mentioned before. They help implement those regulations on behalf of the state and the federal government. So that's our kind of cascade from the big level, the big federal government perspective, all the way down to local. And within these, we have pure scientists. We have people who do regulatory affairs work like I do. And you have people who really have no direct science degrees, but go in and go help implement these in the field. So if you have an interest in this area, any one of these agencies are places for you to go to look for potential jobs. And they're pretty much always hiring. This is a little bit weird situation we're in right at this moment in time, but this won't last. We will go back to it eventually. All right, Tim. All right, I'm going to go through this a little bit faster. So all those programs I talked about, I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking really specifically about air. Because who wants to breathe clean air? Raise your hand, please. Thank you. All right, I got a cup of coffee thing at the end, so. All right, we all want to breathe clean air. And those of us that have lived for a little while, if you recall back in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, when you woke up in the morning, could you see both mountain ranges, the coast and the Sierra? Come on, you guys. Nope. You couldn't. In the early 70s, you could. In the late 70s, all the way through like 95, couldn't see both. Oftentimes, you couldn't see either one. But because of the work that's been done in the Clean Air Act, because of its local application, we now have pretty clean air in this area. It's actually quite amazing. We've actually reduced in the San Joaquin Valley, so the valley that you're living in, we've actually reduced our pollution from stationary sources like a manufacturing plant by about 93%. That's big. That's big, everybody. And folks that do work like I do help make those things happen. We help build those laws and regulations. We help apply those programs that help reduce those emissions, which is kind of cool. You have a real meaningful impact. I mentioned before, pretty much everything needs a permit. The reason everything needs a permit is because there's so many laws and regulations you got to figure out how to comply with. So in order for the regulator to know what you're doing, you have to go get a permit. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But what's particularly unique about California, why this is kind of a target-rich environment looking for a job in these fields, is because we are the most complex in all the nation when it comes to air quality. And I'll show you a map in a minute that's going to show how many different air basins we have throughout the country and throughout the state, excuse me, and how many of those apply to various businesses. But there's just a ton of them throughout the state. And it makes it a very complex thing, a complex world for me to live in. But that's okay, because at the end of the day, because I've been around here a long time, I know that 30 years ago, I couldn't see both mountain ranges, and now I can, which is pretty awesome. Okay, next one, Tim. All right, now for you super geeky scientist nerds in the room. So air quality, as I said, all these programs focus on science to one degree or another, right? So when you look at the pollutants in the air that really matter, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. All heard those? Yep. Carbon dioxide is greenhouse gas emissions, right? So they focus on carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, lead, ozone forming chemicals, things like volatile organic compounds, those are the VOCs, right? So the chemistry background that Tim has and Mike has and I have, understanding those well allows us to understand the regs and figure out how to best manage those programs within our various companies that we work in. Particulate matter. Who knows what particulate matter is? It's not a common word, right? Yeah.
How much dust there is.
How much dust? So the particulate matter at, less than 10 microns, is that something you can see? No. These are basically things that are way smaller than the width of a human hair. They're smaller than you can visually see. But there's regulations out there that we help implement that ensure that the amount of those particulates in the atmosphere stays to the lowest amount possible. Because if you ingest those small particulates, it can trigger things like asthma. It can trigger other respiratory problems in people. So it's super important that even those really, really small particles you can't see get managed correctly. And it's pretty cool that we get to do that and ensure that we're making a safe environment for our employees and that we're making a safe environment for all of our neighbors around us. And that's what the type of job I do, that's what we really hyper focus on. Next slide, Tim. All right. I mentioned about California and all those various air districts that are out there. Okay. This map shows how many air districts. Each one of those colored areas is a different air district. They all have state programs they implement. They also have their own local programs they implement. So if you like complexity and you like to deal with things that are not just A to B to C, but it's like A to B to C to D to Z to V to whatever, P, this is a cool field to be in. Because all of these different air districts have different ways of applying the regulations and the rules, and we have to understand all of them. And we have to work with the regulators to, one, understand them as people, which really does matter, and understand the world they live in and the regulations they're trying to apply to us. So, and again, I like to say it, California is what? The most complicated one in the nation, by far. Nobody does air quality like California does. All right? Before I hand it off to Tim, hopefully I didn't bore you too much with those regulations. Yeah, question.
Do they trip over each other?
Constantly. Constantly.
No.
Yes, part of my job. Yes.
But as in relation to that, does that like the air quality where they're growing the grapes and then, you're moving the grapes here and does that become more complicated with the air where they're growing?
Not so much. Some of the work that Tim gets involved with when there's fires actually can have a negative effect, which is an air quality problem, right? So the movement, not so much, but we try and limit that for all kinds of reasons, including air quality reasons, right? You don't want the trucks on the road any more than necessary. Okay, Tim. Need 4 hands.
Yes. So handing off and just using musical references from the 70s and 80s just to do the transition, I call Chris Earth, Wind and Fire. And of course, I'm Red, Red Wine. So we look at it in the same way that Chris looked at it. I put more of the stuff on the same slide, but I wanted to kind of go through at the same level as the federal, state, local, and international considerations as we think about food and beverage manufacturing. And these are the 4 key federal agencies that we deal with the number one being probably the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, but it's shortened to TTB. Okay. By the way, the one you do not notice up there is ATF. So the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, which really has nothing to do with alcohol anymore, but that's an anomaly. And then the FDA, the customs side of things, and then the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. If you look at their missions, it's all on the slides. The biggest word in all of them is protect. Protect consumer. With the TTB, it's protect revenue, it's protect safety of the product, it's protect our borders, and protecting against so the truth in claims and everything like this. As it relates, the items in bold are the specific acts that relate. Chris had them on one slide. I'm not going to go read through all of them in the interest of time. But where does it apply to us in what we're trying to do? So if you look at the TTB, the first one on the left, SOI stands for Standard of Identity. So the TTB defines to us what a wine is and the practices you can do to make a wine. It defines what another product is, like a whiskey or a gin, okay? And so that's protecting the consumer and saying this must be made in this way or be made from this to be called that, okay? Needless to say, the TTB also collects all the excise taxes, and interestingly enough, the government is shut down, but critical operations are open and collection of excise taxes is considered critical. So we still have to pay our taxes, okay? We look at labeling and labeling issues, they're defined for us. So we go through all of that. Distribution, as we ship our products, there's various rules on how that's handled. There's a 3-tier system that people may understand that goes from the producer to a distributor to the retailer. So that's in law. And then any sales and marketing practices where claims are made, items on label, et cetera, that we have to cover, okay? FDA, not surprisingly, handles a lot to do with protecting the consumer, making sure we have safe products. You hear all along about microbial issues, salmonella or something. It's less so in our products. We're just lucky with the nature of our products. But also with food safety in general, with either chemical, physical, microbiological hazards. They really get into how a facility should be run in terms of safety, in terms of cleanliness. And they watch for any health claims that are made about foods. We are prevented from doing that for alcohol beverage. The customs side of things, protect the American people. You're hearing a lot about that right now with borders, et cetera, et cetera. As it relates to us, there's a lot of concern about bringing goods in and out of the country in terms of how you protect, make sure that nothing is being stolen, that things aren't being taken out of your truck, things aren't being put into your truck, which is worse in my fear on that. And so there's a lot looking at that, and there's programs that we take part in, like CTPAT, that helps trade in protecting itself. And we have best practices so that we limit as much as possible what's going on there, okay? Tariffs and drawbacks, you're hearing a lot on tariffs right now. Very much a tool that's currently being used. We have to monitor all of that, understand the tariffs, pay for them, and work on that. And drawback is another tool that we can use in that space where you can pay money and then draw it back on a subsequent export or import. The Federal Trade Commission, I call it the Truth in Labeling Department. So you can look at it that way. Protect consumers, protect competition, and do public education. The FTC was in the news for the biggest settlement last week. Does anybody know it? Who here has Prime, Amazon Prime? Who has tried to get out of Amazon Prime? Put it another way, who has failed to get out from using Amazon Prime? Right? So there's a big thing that the FTC has now gone into. They settled the FTC with Amazon last week for $2.1 billion. Okay, the biggest settlement ever. And where they're talking about using, what was it called? Dark, I can't remember, dark secrets, dark ways, that basically thinking about AI, predicting human behavior, and basically making it very difficult to get out. So this is some of the things that the FTC deals with. With us, oftentimes it's just truth in labeling, right? Are we saying, can we back up any claim we made? The finest wine west of the Mississippi. How do I prove that? Okay, so those are the types of things that we, as our department, then have to come in and say to the marketer, prove that. So it's kind of fun to do that. Anyway, that's an overview of the federal slides. At the state level, there's a number of departments. The one we deal with most of all is the California Department of Alcohol Beverage Control, or the ABC. But we do have others with food and ag. I think you deal with some of those as well, Chris, with Department of Public Health, obviously you deal with. And what do we deal with states? So there's sometimes you have to register you do have to register alcohol facilities with the ABC. You have to register brands in certain states before you can ship them in there. And then again, it's to do with product and facility safety. So much to do with that as well. At the local activity, I've got Napa County down as one of them. There may be land facility use, which crosses over with what Chris works on. Also things with wineries wanting to do tastings or events, they will have to get approval from the local authorities to do that, and we work on that. The two on the far right, the NCSLA and NABCA, are actually an association of all of these control ABCs. And it's very important for us to work with them if they start coming out with different standards or different ideas, that we work with them to make sure they're good ideas, to be blunt, or to point out to the ABCs why something may be problematic. Any questions on federal or state or local? Let's switch to international then, Chris. So what I've laid down here, if you look in the middle first, what are we watching, right? And much of it is we want trade. It's a very difficult time for trade right now with tariffs. They cause a lot of issues, but a lot of opportunities you can argue too. But we look at barriers to trade that we call non-tariff particularly. So these might be technical concerns where somebody defines a product differently than we do, and we try and work very closely to work that out. I've pointed out here, this is the first side all on the left are what I call government organizations. You've all heard of the WHO. The World Trade Organization tries to make trade easier. Codex is a very specific one for food standards. Okay, and we work very closely with them. Wine and other foods is considered a food, and there are standards for that. And the European Commission is always pushing new ideas on foodstuffs, on food standards, and we have to watch very carefully on that. On the right-hand side are what I call intergovernmental organizations. So that's a combination between a government organization and industry in many cases, and across multiple governments. So OIV, which is based in France, sets up a lot of standards for wine that are then implemented in many areas around the world. Sometimes they're good for us, sometimes they're not so good for us, so we have to watch carefully on that. The World Wine Trade Group is a collaboration with governments and industry in certain countries, and that's a very good outlet for us to talk to governments about ideas they're thinking about and try and standardize across the countries that are part of that. Chris. So what kind of work do we do with the agencies as we've gone through? Chris has talked about what the challenges are. And I think this slide applies to you as well, Chris, in everything that you do. And it's paramount that we have relationships with these key agencies, okay? We can either work directly as Gallo for us, or through trade associations. Sometimes with trade associations, you get more bang for the buck effectively because you're representing the industry. On the wine side, there's two common ones, which is the California Wine Institute, which is for California, and then FIVS, which is an association of global wine industry. The equivalent on the right-hand side, Distilled Spirits Council and the World Spirits Alliance represents spirits, both domestically and internationally. And there's a lot to talk about with responsible drinking right now with IARD. And so this is an organization really pushing and discussing the merits of moderate consumption. All of this is going on via the trade associations. What we do, we monitor and comment on new rules and regulations, or we propose, and this is a wonderful thing that, I didn't think we could do this, but we can, propose regulations to the regulators and say, hey, this one's a problem. If you worked in this area, it'd be much easier for us and you. So we're trying to find the win-wins in many of these. We try and align on best practices if it's coming across internationally, okay? And then when issues arise, and they do, either at a company level or the industry level, we are contact points for the governments, for the agencies to come back and say, hey, what are you doing about this? Okay? So it's very important to keep all of these in play as we work with regulators. Chris? Yes. The first two are things we never want to see, okay? What are the consequences of non-compliance, okay? So we've talked about it, at its ultimate level, there are criminal, for wanton disregard, there are criminal severe violations, monetary fines, imprisonment. We haven't seen that, thankfully, okay? But monetary fines, yes, these are hypothetical, okay? But monetary fines and shutdowns is one of the biggest ones, okay? That you have to watch for, right? So all of those agencies that we talked about can shut down the facility. And as we're a for-profit company, shutting down a facility can have serious impacts on what we do. So we really need to work closely and carefully with our regulators listen to them, work with them, but explain to them what's the workable solution to many of these issues. Okay, Chris, have I anything else that I need to cover there? You've talked about knowing violations of 100,000 a day. I think it's all self-explanatory. Okay, so sorry, go ahead.
Any questions about any of that?
Yeah, do any of these agencies have on-site monitors, people on-site?
Yeah, they do. So FDA has on-site monitors at a lot of locations. If you're a major food processor, yeah, they have on-site people there. If you have,
Who that person is?
what's that?
Everyone knows that person?
Yeah, they wear their proper designations. And they usually have an office within the plant itself. So you got to be a really big food processor. I've done something majorly wrong though for that to be the case. So I've been fortunate in my career. I've never seen that because I don't work in high risk foods. But if you do things like I'm not sure poultry is a good example, but what's that? Hot dogs, lettuce, things that have high potential for transmission. If they're not cleaned properly, they tend to have people on site. And it's not like it's a punitive thing. They just want to make sure that they're doing everything they can to protect the consumer, which is great. That's what you want them to do, right? Very, very rarely do we have recalls. They happen occasionally, but we can all walk into a grocery store anywhere in the US and pretty much buy anything. And 99.999% of the time, it's going to be fine. And it's because of those laws and regulations and people like us that help enforce them, right? That's what matters. Okay, now let's get into some of the translatable skills. And Tim, you and I can do this together because it matters. So next slide for a minute. So if you want to get into the fields like we're in, right? Tim and I are scientists by training. That is not the only discipline that gets you into these kind of fields. STEM matters, right? So the science, technology, engineering, and math. If you're doing that as a part of your curriculum, or that's what you're focused on for your degrees, that's absolutely a great entry into this type of field. But it's not the only one. You can do criminal justice. You can have an MBA, right? Tim has an MBA. He's one of those rare people. It's a technical person, actually has a business degree as well. You can be public administration, right? Because remember, we deal with regulators a lot. So having a public administration degree really is super helpful. And my point of all this is to just have a really clear walk away from this conversation is it doesn't matter what you're currently studying or what you think you might study. All of those can apply in these fields. And again, as a little podunk person growing up in Modesto, when Modesto was 50,000 people back in the 60s and 70s, I was not exposed to this kind of stuff. So I happened into it more by accident than by design. It's been a phenomenal career for me, and we'll talk about that in a slide in a minute. But most people who do what Tim and I do fell into it by accident. Either we showed an aptitude and someone recognized it in us, or we just found a pathway for ourselves because we saw opportunities and we saw the need. So that's really pretty cool. Criminal justice matters. Some of the skills, though, that you will develop in school, strategic thinking really matters. If you want to be successful in this field, you need to be thinking more than just yes or no, black or white. You need to be thinking strategically about the things that you're dealing with. Tim and I literally do that every single day. I doubt there's an hour in our day that goes by that we're not forced to think strategically about our roles in the organizations that we work for, which is pretty cool. And I mentioned critical thinking, but I'll mention it again, right? So, we all spend a lot of time on our phones. We all spend a lot of time reading newspapers or whatever your methodology for ingesting information is. Being able to not just read something, but read something for intent and be critical about what it really means and how you can apply it in your world matters a lot. Because remember my earlier comment, I said that regulations are sometimes subject to interpretation. They're frequently subject to interpretation because when they write laws and regulations, they tend to not be very specific, unfortunately. So it leaves it to people to figure out how best to apply them. So being a critical thinker really helps. Now I'm going to hand it to Tim to talk about the soft skills, which are equally, if not more important.
Yeah, I think it's all spelled out there, Chris, in terms of public speaking. notwithstanding what we're showing here, it is a plus that you're able to speak in a public environment. But negotiation skills, you've heard us talk about being able to talk to regulators, different interpretations. You will often have a regulator come to you and talk about, you must do it this way, and sometimes remember, they're trying to get up in their career path too, so they want to make a mark. And you want to talk to them and say, no, we don't see it this way. And then the game begins, the negotiations begin. And you really need to know the regulations, know the background, and know your position, and then know the skills to be able to get to win-win or yes for everybody, okay? Writing skills, notwithstanding ChatGPT and other things, it is still very important to have writing skills to be able to express your opinions. But different points of view. We've stressed a lot about the private industry, government, different points of view. Just think about when you're trying to deal with multiple governments on that around the world, multiple industries around the world, which we have to do, as we've talked about, and how do we get to a win in all of those? And it's a lot of negotiation and a lot of work, but as Chris said, it's a very fun part of our jobs to be able to do that. Good people, leaders, you must be able to lead. You must, right? Whatever form of leading, it doesn't have to be directly managing people, but you must be able to lead a project, a conversation, a negotiation, whatever it is. Those are the skills when you start to get, and higher in this area and this field. It's really important to do that.
Any questions about any of that? Does that make sense to you guys? Anything a surprise up there? Yeah, questions. Yeah, by which one? All of them?
AI.
AI?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, you answer.
I don't know how to answer it, but
Well, I have to do ChatGPT to answer it, so no. Yeah, I mean, the reality is for us to do our jobs well, because we have to stay ahead of everything that's happening around us. Being able to use the latest and greatest technology really does matter. And AI, there's no question, it's influence in our lives. It does literally every day right now. In our world, you wouldn't think about it because you think our world is kind of like gray and it doesn't move very fast. Well, the reality is actually moves quite quickly, and being engaged in AI helps us get there. I don't know how many conversations Tim and I had over the years about blockchain, when blockchain was kind of the big thing, right? Which is a little bit of a blockchain's really, if you think about crypto, right? It's how you track where things are in the various supply chain stuff. So it's good to be on top of it. It's part of being well-rounded is really what it comes down to.
Interact with senior management.
That's a great question. So the question is, how do we interact with senior management? So in good companies, and I've been fortunate to work for pretty much all good companies in my career, you generally have a seat at the table. So you're part of the executive team, or you work for someone on the executive team. And our job is to bring forward changing regulations and how we need to adjust the business to adapt to that. Or if we see a problem developing, to report that to senior leadership and then have a response plan in place. Or if there happens to be an accident, because accidents happen, right? It's just the nature of things, is we need a seat at the table with those executive teams to be able to properly respond to an accident when it occurs. So, answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, what a great question. So the question was, what programs do manufacturers have that allow people to get into this kind of field? And the reality is there's not a ton of them. Because as I mentioned before, which one do you want?
That one.
That one? Okay. Yes, you can go to the next slide. Part of what we've been talking about is how do we build programs and processes to actually get people in that are right out of school, that can get them in effectively like a journeyman type of program and let them learn on the job. So some companies do it reasonably well. I think within my company over the years, we've done pretty well at that. We've actually developed an onboarding program that takes people who are literally fresh out of high school or fresh out of college, and then identifies training for them that they can go take, and then through both that training, exposure to people who do that job today, and then exposure to actually a real work environment that will bring them up to speed over time. But what we'd love to have, and what we'd like the opportunity to do, and I think there's an opportunity to do that here at JC, is to actually go build a class that is built around this. One, to expose people to it so they know that it's out there. And the second thing is, we just really hit the high points of the waves today, right? But to do a deeper dive on all this stuff, because if someone came to me and said, hey, I'd like a job in your department, or they came to Tim, what would give them a leg up if they were younger and less experienced is having gone through a class like this where they already knew some of the basics. They're not going to know it all because you kind of have to be in this field for a long time to be expert at it. But there's a lot of things we can do to give them a leg up. That was a great question. Okay, we're getting close. So final tips and takeaways, and Tim, we'll do this together. So the world of regulatory affairs and compliance is here to stay. It's not going to change. And we're maybe a little bit nerdy, but not too nerdy. It's actually kind of fun. It's challenging. The work is challenging. The way you can do the work can make it really enjoyable and very entertaining. And I mean entertaining in a positive way. You get to use all your skills, right? I don't go into my desk and sit down and look at a computer every day, and that's all I do. I'm thinking about the next thing. I'm thinking about how to apply a regulation. I'm thinking about how to change our business to be better at what we do. Part of my job is sustainability. So I have the sustainability department that reports into me. That whole mission is to go be more efficient about how we run our business and have the least possible impact on the environment that we can, and make sure that we're protecting our people along the way. That's a cool part of my job. So it is very, very unique and opportunistic out there. It does translate into multiple career opportunities like we talked about. There's all kinds of things. There's private sector, there's government, there's nonprofit. There's all kinds of jobs out there that fit this, and it is a growing field. And it's actually hard for us to go source people who are actually qualified to do the work. So when Mr. Coomer back there left my organization, it took us a while to find the person we needed because he had a very unique skill set and 35 plus years, 40 years experience doing the work. You don't replace that just easily. So it's a growing field. You want to comment on this, Tim, or let me finish this and you do the last one? Okay. If you're local and you want to stay local, there's a chance to stay local. I have a very good job. I have a very good career. I've been able to manage it mostly by staying local because my family's still here and that was part of my desire. So you can be very successful, have a good career, stay local, and this is one field you can do that in, which I think is pretty awesome. Education and soft skills are critical. We went through that a minute ago. Those soft skills that Tim talked about, incredibly important. Don't think you can just be a pure scientist or a pure technical person and be successful. Not in this field. You need those soft skills. So if you have a desire to grow into this, I would really think about some of the things we talked about, including AI. And the last thing, exposure and experience is essential for long-term success. I mentioned earlier that most of us got in this field through accident because we didn't know it was a possibility. And because these fields have been growing for the last 25, 30 years. So, but we think there's an opportunity to improve that. So with that, I'm gonna let Tim bring us home here with that final statement up there.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we want to find ways to, as we said, take the accident out of learning these. No one has come in that I know of who has done a career in compliance. Never heard of it in my mind. More so in environmental, but less so in our space. So we have to retrain. We have to learn everybody. Sorry, try that again. We have to train everybody, teach everybody, not learn. So we have to do all of that. We want to get people in who have that experience. This is the concept that we're talking about, of developing and exposing people to these skills, be they negotiation, be they the regulations, be they how to talk to people on the regulations. We see an opportunity for that. We think that will help us in terms of getting a quicker learning curve in the job. We think that will help candidates get a leg up in terms of applying for jobs with us. So with that, that's pretty much a wrap up for us on the world of manufacturing, compliance, regulatory affairs, and what we do. So thank you very much for your attendance and attention.
And also questions.
Yep.